Well, let's jump straight in with it. So this is a image of Bruno that I think somebody's probably generated with AI, but I liked it. So the talk I gave the other day was broken down like this. So very quick run over the Renaissance. Some of the stuff you may know already. So Renaissance Italy. There was no king of Italy or whatever. It was all divided up into lots of little bits. It was incredibly wealthy. So
when we say Renaissance, what kind of period would you define that as?
Different historians define it as different periods, but I'm talking about maybe 1400 to 1600, something like that.
Okay.
Mainly 1500 to 1600.
Mm-hmm.
So extraordinarily wealthy because the Crusades had ended, and so lots of silks and spices and things were coming from that part of the world through the ports of...
British wool as well, I think.
Yeah, the wool was a really important part of the wealth generation, and also they mined a particular substance in Italy that was used in wool production. Yeah, so this is a picture of one of the buildings in the Vatican, and of course that's a demonstration of enormous wealth. There was so much money around that banking almost literally got invented during the Renaissance. Which brings me on to the Medicis. Cosimo Medici was kind of second generation, so his dad kind of started the Medici. Immensely rich. This picture makes it look like there's a big age difference between him and his wife. They were painted at different times. They were actually almost exactly the same age. So the Medicis were extraordinarily wealthy. They were very into doing things that you can say as kind of public good things. So they made incredible buildings. And one of the really nice stories, I think, from this period, because if you love books, as I know you do, you'll know things like the Library of Alexandria burning down, or that really sad stories. Well, this is a really positive story. The Medicis funded scouts to go in search of rare books all over the known world. So these people would go and visit monasteries and things, and of course this is only recently into the invention of the printing press, and a lot of books hadn't been printed, and so only existed in written form, and they tended to be, monasteries were repositories of these books. Of course, books that were kind of approved of by the religion would be copied more often. Books that were less approved of wouldn't. This meant that, of course, we're talking about periods of hundreds of years since these books were written or first copied, and so books would get mouldy, get thrown out. So there was a gradual loss of particular works.
Yeah, yeah.
And they really did find some really quite important works, these scouts going out.
Sean Connery was one of in the Name of the Rose. Remember that?
Yes.
No, he was a detective, wasn't he? So they were all kept in the tower of the unapproved books were kept in the tower. Name of the Rose.
So they did actually find unapproved books. Like there was I can't remember his name now, but a famous Roman poet who wrote very obscene poetry. They found one copy of that. You can even read the obscene poems online if you're open to that.
If you read Latin.
Yes.
So where did they bring them back to, the Medicis?
Back to Medici's Central.
Which was Florence, right?
Yes. It would have been Florence. So this guy is Ficino. So the Medici's fabulously wealthy. One of the things they do was patronise intellectuals, fund and artists, of course, lots of famous artworks. Ficino was one of the intellectuals. He was a philosopher, he was a translator, he was a, I guess you use the word magician, in that he wrote books on magic. So one of the things that the Medicis got him to do was translate Plato. And at the time, there was this idea that, which is kind of the opposite to how we think today. Today, we think that, as we progress forwards, we know more and more, understand the world more. They kind of thought that if they worked backwards and that the ancients really knew stuff, and we gradually forgotten it. And so the further you went back, the better the source. So Ficino was translating Plato. Yeah, one of the really interesting stories about the.
That was a generalized viewpoint, or was Ficino's?
That was a fairly general viewpoint. Yeah. So I mean, even then, for hundreds of years, you'll know that Aristotle was the main man in terms of, if you went to university, you studied Aristotle. Aristotle has a lot of nonsense in his work. And one of the outcomes of the scouts going out was that they found quite a lot more ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, including one which is Lives of the Philosophers, which was a kind of review of all the philosophy of the time. And what they, to much to their surprise, what they found out was that at the time, Aristotle wasn't actually very highly rated. And this was a big shock. And in the Lives of the Philosophers, it kind of lists the important philosophers, and then Aristotle is down in the footnotes. So the Medicis got Ficino, first of all, doing a translation of Plato from one of these found books, but then they found a text in Constantinople by Hermes Trismegistus, who was, I don't think I've ever said that before, Hermes Trismegistus, who was supposedly a contemporary with Moses, so more ancient than Plato. There's a few things that you might have heard of him. The Emerald Tablet is one of his kind of sacred texts.
No.
As above, so below.
Missed those.
It's not particularly well known. So when they found this, they thought, this is even more important than the ancient Greeks because it's even older. So they got Ficino translating that. And it really was a very influential work. This is one of Ficino's translations of the Corpus Hermeticum, the body of Hermes' work. So Ficino himself wrote quite a lot of books, including this book, 3 books on life. And he wrote a lot about magic. He believed in the magic of imagery, that you could use imagery and statues to kind of channel the energies of the planets. And depending on which planet you channeled, you would get different results. And one thing I found really interesting about the time is that we know that when paintings like the Primavera were commissioned, they had this thing called a program, which was basically a specification of the picture. So it's thought that Botticelli, for instance, wasn't educated enough to understand all the symbolism that is in his paintings. There's an awful lot of symbolism in these paintings.
So whoever commissioned it was sort of like set it out, like top left-hand corner.
So the Medicis would say, okay, we want this painting for a wedding. They would ask Medici, or there were another couple of other intellectuals like this one called Pico, long Italian name, another guy, I can't remember. Anyway, there were various of these guys, and they would basically ask them to write a spec for the painting. So when they did this, and all of these guys were, also believed in magic, and there wasn't the distinction that we have nowadays between science and magic.
Science hadn't been invented at this point.
It was all the same thing.
Yeah.
Astrology as well and astronomy, it was all mixed up. So in the Primavera, there's all kinds of references going on to astrology. The character on the left is Mercury, also known as Hermes, and he's got the little trident with two little kind of dragons on the end, which may be a reference to Hermes Trismegistus. There's also all kinds of stuff. Anyway, basically in the middle you've got Venus, so this would be channeling Venus, and Venus is like really positive energy, fertility and life and joy, all great things like that. I thought I'd contrast this to this one by Dora, which is melancholy, so like depression. This picture also has a lot of symbology in it, but it's channeling Saturn rather than Venus. And Saturn, if you were an intellectual, you were thought to have a lot of influence of Saturn, and whereas Venus was all joy and fertility and all that kind of stuff, Saturn's kind of dryness and stone and non-positive things. That's just another example of
Non-positive things under what frame though? Because you say that the intellectuals are associated with sort of dry and cold. Is that intellectual?
Well,
is that intellectually
prone to depression?
Prone to depression.
Yeah.
No, because I'm just wondering if there was even back then sort of a distinction between, say, what we might term now right brain, left brain thinking, and even back then the sort of the intellectual was cold and logical, and the
there were these distinctions, and a lot of the magic at that time I see as actually quite sophisticated psychology, but they just didn't have the terms for that now. So nowadays, when you apply to a job, you have a Briggs-Myers test and you get those kind of ratings. The whole Saturn-Venus thing, the planets, it's that kind of thing. It's just put in different terms.
Yeah.
And there's lots of instances of that where you can look at the magic of the time as essentially psychology before they knew how to do psychology as we do nowadays. Going back in time a bit, and this is pre-Renaissance.
I thought you spelled it wrong in the front bit.
Did it? Well, it's 2 L's and 2 L's.
Yeah, but on the front part, you've
Did I miss
yeah.
it? So this is another picture from that guy on Deviant, like this one as well. Yes, so Bruno was lived on Menorca. He spoke Arabic. Like I said, he was the legend is that he invented the Catalan language. He's a Catholic saint. So, of course, nothing to do with magic at all. All of this is magical. If you look at his Wikipedia pages, it's obviously vetted and it's got its thing saying he's a saint.
He's a Catholic saint, okay.
Yeah. So, this non-magical stuff that he did. So, this circular diagram that you see here, around those letters represent different aspects of the goodness of God, and then you have these concentric circles, and the idea is that you can rotate these circles, and in doing so you can ask questions. I think it wasn't him, but later this became Ars Combinatoria, and Leibniz got quite into it.
Okay.
So you can make different combinations of these letters, and you can actually kind of ask this questions and get answers about about God, basically.
About God.
Yeah.
So I was about to say it's about like a Ouija board, but it's about God specifically, the
I
Christian.
think so. Yeah. Well, I'm not quite because of the nature, you can see Gloria Bonitas.
Hmm.
Because of the nature of what the different letters mean, I'm not sure how many useful questions you can really ask. But that was, because he spoke Arabic, he travelled to Arabia.
Hmm.
It's probably based on, I'm not going to pronounce this right, Zawja, which is an Arabic device. Very, very similar astrological device where you can rotate different concentric circles
Hmm.
and make predictions about the future and ask questions of him. Have you seen, do you know Philip Pullman, the author?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So he wrote something called The Dark Materials.
That's it.
The Dark Materials is from Milton. He's got lots and lots of references in his books. So in that, a big part of the story revolves around this particular device where you can ask questions. Anyway, that comes from this. Is actually read some of the same books I found out afterwards that I did in researching Bruno. Okay, so we got on to Bruno at last. So that's all the background. So Bruno, the kind of popular story of Bruno is that he was.
Sorry, you say so we got onto Bruno. So that was all in the background. So what? Bruno was part of the Renaissance. I mean, when was he born? So he was coming out of Ficon. Is it Ficona? The Italian. He was coming out of the Medici's.
Yeah. So he was born in I can't remember what it was, 1547, I think. And he was burned at the stake in 1600 as part of the Catholic Church. I'm not a huge fan of the Catholic Church, but I try and keep it down. As part of the celebrations of the Catholic Church, he was burned at the stake. And the common, for the millennium, the common story is that he was burned because of his belief that the Earth went around the sun and that the stars were other suns and things like this. So his cosmological ideas. And I think the common story is basically wrong. It's very misleading how it's presented.
Yeah.
So that there's a statue in Rome in the Campo di Fiori, where people go on February the 17th every year, which is the anniversary of his burning. And you can see he's got his.
People go. You mean like believers in science, scientists?
Yeah, I really want to go. Kind of all kinds of weirdos and nerds and atheists and every imaginable type of outcast. I think. But so this is how Bruno is often represented, and so as a priest. And this in itself is kind of misleading because he was excommunicated at 28. So he only became a priest at 24. So there was a 4-year period when he might have something like this. We don't actually have any pictures from the time of what he looked like. The first picture that we have was 117 years after his death, something like that. So the person who drew it obviously had never seen him and did him in these Benedictine robes. He wouldn't have dressed like that. I think he might dress like this guy. The reason being that this is a painting by Caravaggio, and Caravaggio is known now that what he did was to take biblical scenes and different mythological scenes and paint people as they dressed at the time in Renaissance Italy. It's kind of quite contemporary idea, I think, even now. And so, yeah, in his scenes, he was painting people as they painted. And you've got to remember, Florence were incredibly wealthy at that time.
Mm.
So even though, this guy is probably not one of the upper classes, he's just a sort of middle class guy. And so Bruno would have dressed like this. And since I did this presentation, I've actually found there's a paper in the 16th century journal or something like that, where somebody writes a whole paper on what Bruno would have dressed like. And it actually contains a little quote, an extract from a letter, that Bruno wrote, where he basically said, when he was travelling from having run away, basically, when he was excommunicated, that the house that he was staying in, the owners persuaded him to throw his habit away and gave him a cloak and a hat and a sword, and, all the things
All
that
that
this guy's
contemporary, like. But he was Florence based, was he?
Yeah, so he moved around an incredible lot, and so when he was burnt at the stake that was in Rome, of course, and Caravaggio, who painted this picture, and Bruno were not of dissimilar ages, but Caravaggio was a bit younger, but there's a chance that he was actually at the burning, because it was, lots of people went there.
Mm-hmm.
There's an Italian film made in the 60s which shows Caravaggio at the burning. This is another Caravaggio picture of the Virgin Mary. I kind of like the comparison between Caravaggio and Bruno, because I think that there's some kind of similarities. They both kind of like to be provocative. They were very outspoken. They, we know that Bruno really liked women. He wrote books on sex magic or essays on sex magic. Caravaggio also was really into women and men. There was quite a lot, I think, of similarities between them. So that brings me on to why did Bruno get burned to the stake, basically. And he had lots of views that were, I think even today would be offensive to Catholics. One of which was that Mary wasn't a virgin, therefore Jesus wasn't divine. He had a father who was a Roman centurion called Pantera.
Okay.
There are, documents that didn't make it into the Bible that say this. So that there is documentary evidence that this could have been the case. So that's pretty big, right? So Jesus not divine, Mary not a virgin. Worse than that, he thought that Jesus was a magician, not the proper sort of magician like he was, like basically just a conjurer. Cheap tricks, as it were, for turning water into wine, cursing a fig tree, watering the water, multiplying loaves of bread, all that kind of thing. They were just conjuring tricks as far as Bruno was concerned. And he was a very outspoken guy, and he didn't like to, he wouldn't dial it back. So you can imagine that he was not a popular guy. He got into trouble all the time. He was excommunicated by 3 different churches, which is pretty much a record. I don't think
3 different churches, meaning?
So the Catholic Church, the Lutheran Church, and what the other one been? I don't know.
Okay, but not. Okay, yeah.
So yes, he wrote various books, including one on magic, which is really interesting. You can get a translation online, where he goes through all the different types of magic at that time. His book's actually really fascinating, I find. I'm really interested in information visualization. For quite a while I've been wanting a book that basically gives you all the different structures of information. So you can have linear information, you can have networks, you can have trees, all of this kind of thing. And I've never found one that was particularly satisfying in this respect. I recently found out that Bruno actually wrote it. So he had an incredible mental capacity and incredible imagination, incredible memory. So this book, part of what it does is actually just list all the different ways you can structure mental information. So you can imagine a sky, you can imagine a sky into a grid, you can imagine then it coming down into 3D forms, and he goes through all of them. You can imagine a tree again. He imagines all of these different things and lists basically all the different ways you can do that, which to me is just amazing because we don't, nobody talks about what you can do with the mind in that kind of way nowadays. And this was what Bruno was really all about. A general account of bonding is super interesting. Like I was saying before, a lot of the magic of the time I look at as being quite advanced psychology, but not using the word that we would use nowadays. So bonding was about, it talks about all different kinds of bonding, but bonding between people is one of them. So, at the time Machiavelli was one of the Florentine Renaissance people. Everybody knows his book of advice to princes on how to behave. Of course, it was useful if you were an intellectual to write stuff that was useful to the elite. And in this book on bonding, he talks about how you can get bonds formed to you without the bonds going the other way. So if you're in a leadership position, you want all those bonds, but you don't want them going the other way. In other words, you want everybody to kind of love you and do what you say, but you don't want to have to love them and do what they say. Right?
Okay. I mean, psychology by another name, but what might it? Is there any school he might follow, or is that sort of just too much following the metaphor too detailed? A school of psychology. I mean, what might his advice have been? Was it similar to Machiavelli, but just called magic, or I mean, why was it distinct in that sense?
Influences. That's why I did the intro bit. I mentioned Raoul, but in terms of the magic, Raoul affected a lot about a particular type of magic, which we'll talk about in a moment. But he was very influenced by Ficino, and in fact, he travelled to the UK and he gave a talk at Oxford University. It went down very well, very badly, because he had a character that really didn't go with the intellectual character at the time in the UK, I think. And he introduced himself in a very grand manner, and he was essentially accused afterwards of plagiarising Ficino. Ficino was a known philosopher then. It was heavily influenced by that. But he was extremely widely read. So I've been kind of playing down the cosmology and the Earth going around the sun and all that stuff. That was a big part of his thinking. But again, that thinking was around a lot at the time. So he'd read various other people on that. With regards to that, and what part of his thought was original. So the other thing around the sun bit wasn't original. But people hadn't thought through, the implications of that, or that there were still ideas from the earlier cosmology that was still very prevalent. So this idea of the 5 layers, so you've got water, then earth, then air, then fire, then the 5th element, the celestial element. So that was still very much a thing, and the idea that these kind of spheres going out. And so some of these things were kind of church doctrine, and you couldn't question them. And of course, with that model, then eventually you get to a limit. And so the idea that space was infinite wasn't doctrine, as I understand it. And also the stars were still what's on an outer sphere kind of thing, holds through to the celestial realm, or that kind of idea. But Bruno realised that the other stars were other suns, that they probably had planets going around them too, that there might be life on those planets. I think that was quite an original idea then. And of course, this kind of stuff wasn't popular with the religious people, because of course that opens a whole bunch of questions if you've got life on other planets. But seeing, like I say, at the time there wasn't this distinction between kind of factual science and more fantastic ideas or spiritual ideas. And really the way I read Bruno is that those ideas, although he was right, they were really spiritual ideas. So he got them not by doing any science, he got them kind of by going through a mental journey and travelling up and seeing the stars kind of move with him, as he had such a powerful mind. You can imagine that. And then looking back on Earth and looking out, and, that's how he draw those conclusions. Which of course is a completely legitimate way to do stuff, but it's not really science, right? So lots of people had other ideas, but they were wrong. So now we look at them as just being magical ideas. He had magical ideas, but they were right.
Right. I mean, he had theoretical ideas that weren't testable with under the science of the time. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it's.
But yeah, I mean, within those ideas, there was still, I've just described the bits that were right. He also had lots of ideas within that framework that were just wrong. So that there were, this idea that then there's an outer realm with, it's really, really bizarre. But like there's weasels, magical weasels or something really ridiculous. He kind of still hung on to some of these ideas that were quite popular at the time. So yeah, that's that. On the Shadow of Ideas, I just love the title. This one is great books, I think, and a lot of it's about abstraction and abstract thought. And a big part of it, so you can see in the page here, the influence of Raman Olive. He basically took that Ars Combinatoria idea and really ran with it incredibly far, because he had such an incredible brain. But he didn't really need paper to do this stuff. He could construct these things in his mind. And one thing I haven't mentioned is that he was really well known for his memory ability.
Yeah.
So he would perform for people, party tricks. He performed in front of one of the popes. And at that time, a lot of people had good memories, and they had techniques for having good memories, because with particular books, you'd have to go to where the book was. They wouldn't give it to you. You could go into a room and spend a couple of days reading it at a monastery or whatever, and then you'd have to leave it and go away. So people had developed, since ancient times, different techniques for memorizing things. And Bruno took those techniques and built upon them. And his kind of main magical thing, so this slide shows...
Because obviously there's the memory palace technique. Did he... Because that became into sort of more generally used at some point, and I understand sort of really sort of gave a step forward on that technique being used, gave a step forward in people's ability to memorize things. Was he Are you saying sort of he had his own technique, or did he invent that memory
So
palace thing?
the memory palace technique dates right back to, well, the first reference that I think we have to it is Cicero.
Oh, okay, so it was way before,
Cicero,
right, right.
way back. So Cicero tells the story of Simonides. Simonides was at a restaurant and lots of people there, a party. He went out to have a cigarette, the roof collapsed. Uh, Police came and said, "Can you tell us everybody who's there?" He, um, of course, just trying to think of who everybody was there, he didn't do a very good job of it. But then he realised that if he actually thought about the tables, and then he went round each table, he could remember everybody there. And so he made that link between um, the um, the physical location of things and memorising. So it dates right back, and there's references to it all through the medieval period.
Okay, then so
Yeah.
Bruno was able built on that.
Yeah, built on that in a couple of different ways. I think we know uh, another memory technique is basically making images in your mind. So this can be combined with the memory palace technique. So if you have your memory palace and you want to remember, let's say, phone numbers, and you want to put them into your memory palace, the way you can do that is you remember 100 different things. So 100 gives you 2 digits, right? So you divide your 6-digit phone number into 3 things using those numbers, and then you combine those 3 things into one image and make it as ridiculous as possible, right?
My goodness. Okay.
So that's people who do memory competitions learn. They learn lists of things, and so that they can do that. It's a very effective technique. So on this page, you can see that one of the things this on the Shadow of Ideas book contains is lists of different kinds of images. And these images that can be combined together in order to create these kind of ridiculous images that stick in the mind. But one of the interesting things is that they're all kind of magical images or images from astrology, or that there was an influential magic book at the time called the Picatrix, which has long lists of these kind of, it's the kind of stuff you get on tarot cards. So it would be a one-legged man holding up the earth with a red cloak on, with a sword or something like that. And there's just lists and lists of these images. But in the Picatrix, all of these images are like talismans. They have you can put this on your t-shirt and it will give you a particular power, a special power, or jewellery or whatever. So what Bruno did was combine the memory techniques with the magical ideas. So what he basically did, I'll just go into this next slide. This is Frances Yates, who's one of the main Bruno historians. She's a bit controversial nowadays. She was writing about Bruno in the 70s and the Hermeticism and Hermes Trismegistus and all that kind of stuff. Really great books to read. They're a bit academic, but if you like this kind of stuff, she's one of the best authors. And so, according to Frances Yates, and this makes sense to me. What Bruno did was basically created that kind of Ars Combinatorial wheel in his mind with kind of all of the knowledge at that time, which we couldn't do nowadays. But then you could kind of pretty much know everything there was to know. And Bruno, at least he would have thought that he knew everything there was to know. So he took all of that and made it into these wheels. And what Frances Yates did in this diagram was basically from his writings, try to reconstruct what Bruno's memory wheel would have been like. And this would have given Bruno magical powers. I mean, you could look at it if you just want to talk about it in a non-magical way, that he had an ability that would have seemed magical at the time to come up with lots of new ideas. You know, nowadays there are kind of card games that you can get if you're work for business, where if you're trying to come up with new creative ideas for products and stuff, you can use these cards to do it.
Yep.
And it does work pretty well. And those card games are actually based on this kind of magic. So he would have been able to come up with new ideas using all of the knowledge in the world at the time, at least that's how he would have seen it.
So when you say it was enabled him to perform the magic, what was about was him being able to go through an innovation process based on a massive pool of factual knowledge and be able to create stuff out of that.
Combine things together.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
there would also been, you know,
Because you keep saying magic, but I was just trying to sort of hook on to what you meant by in that context. So it would have appeared magic to people at the time for him to invent things, or was he doing something a bit more manual, or putting a cat out of a hat? Or no, clearly, but
well,
what?
it's really difficult to say, but people at the time did really believe in this magic. And Bruno almost certainly, I mean, he wrote lots of books and there's no reason to think that he didn't believe that this stuff was magical. So in these wheels, there are things like the astrological symbols from the Becatrix and other books, which he would have been able to combine together mentally, and those kind of things would have had a magical significance to him. So he undoubtedly thought that he could do magic. On the other hand, you know, he also definitely had a very kind of practical side. One of the story in fact of when he got into trouble initially. So he basically ran away from Italy and travelled around, including into to England and various other places. Travelled around for many years. Came back to Italy. I guess he'd hoped that things would have died down and nobody was kind of hunting him anymore. And stayed with somebody. The deal was that Bruno would teach this guy the memory techniques to pay for his board and lodging while he was there. And the guy that he was teaching was very disappointed when he found out that the techniques were just mental methods, you know, learning lists and that kind of thing.
Rather than
talked about.
Not connecting with some supernatural
he didn't
being.
mention any magic, and he actually wanted to have magical abilities. And that's why he reported him to the authorities. He reported him about some of his heretical views, as we've talked about.
But from Bruno's perspective, because you just said sort of in the memory palace he may have certain symbols from the Becatrix and whatnot, and he was able to combine them and come up with something that he considered magic. What have you got an example on that? Because
well, I mean, we don't. There's not any recorded instances that I know of him doing magic, but his abilities were certainly seen as being magical. And like as I said, it's more of a mindset that we've just lost nowadays. So at the time, if I can go back to the Botticelli painting, the Primavera, this contains lots and lots of symbology that is, you know, would have been considered magical at the time. And as I said, Ficino wrote a book on magic, and that would have influenced how this painting was made. And the way I think about it is that, you know, we look at it now as magic, but in some ways it didn't make sense. It was, you know, people will see this painting nowadays and say it's a magical painting. People travel all around the world to go and see this painting. It has a lot of influence. It will move a lot of minds and make people think a lot of things. And that's, you know, it all relates to that stuff like the channeling of the different planets and the kind of energy that comes out of a painting like this, and forming bonds with people. And so, let me just go to one of my later slides. Nowadays, companies like Coca-Cola spend a fortune on advertising, right? And advertising is all about forming bonds, and it's getting people to bond to your product. And I'm sure if you showed this to Ficino, he would say, oh yeah, this is channeling Venus. And Bruno might have added, yeah, it's forming bonds out to people. Right? So they would see it in a magical way. We now explain it in terms of psychology.
Got it. Yeah.
But yeah, both viewpoints are right. We're just kind of using a different way to frame the thing.
To phrase it
Yeah.
more than, yeah.
So a lot of the magic of the time. So just coming up with original ideas, because the mindset at that time was different. That could well have been seen as a kind of magical ability, you know, to think of something that nobody's ever thought of before. Whereas nowadays we wouldn't see it that way. But I think that Bruno's mental wheels would have given him that kind of ability, and if you met him, you at the time you would have been extremely impressed. But he was a jerk, and that's what got him burnt in the end. You know, he was in. His trial actually went on for 7 years. It was enormously long, and they did give him lots of outs, and they did kind of try and try and get him to let himself off the hook. But he was such a stubborn guy that, and he thought he was kind of cleverer than everybody else. So even when they did this, he would try and be clever about it. So he'd kind of make a simple statement that was what they wanted to hear. And then he'd make a much more clever statement that he thought only the really clever ones that would agree with him would understand, where he was actually saying the opposite. And he thought he could get away with doing that, but they were wise to that. Anyway, so Bruno is just a fascinating character, but the whole thing of Renaissance magic I just find fascinating.